Won't find it online.
All right, good morning.
Morning.
Just trying to make sure everything's working correctly. All right, it's good to be back with you guys this morning. You guys should have in front of you, a set of notes for lesson 253, assessing the printed history of the King James text, Blayney, and the 1769 Oxford text. So this is the last of the major revisions that we're going to be working our way through. Then we're going to talk about the American text and probably be done for the season. I don't know how long all that will necessarily take. But if you're joining us right now and you want to follow along with the notes, you can go to gracelifebiblechurch.com, scroll down under recent sermons, and click on the link for February 9, and you'll be able to open the notes that we're going to be following here in class. So, all right, again, lesson 253, assessing the printed history of the King James text, Blayney, and the 1769 Oxford text. Let's get into the introduction. So since lesson 249, we've been looking at the editorial work of F.S. Paris. So we did that basically starting in lesson 249 through the bonus lesson that we did last time we had class 2 weeks ago. Okay. So since that lesson 249, we've been looking at the editorial work of F.S. Paris upon the text of the King James Bible. All told, we have considered the following aspects of his work. So we looked at change in noun forms from singular, not plural. Mike and I are still talking about changing that wording there, but that was lesson 249. Okay. Second, restore definite articles that had been omitted in the 1611. That was in lesson 249 as well. Then we looked at changes in the definitive article to a possessive pronoun in lesson 249. We saw addition of apostrophes and possessive forms in lesson 251. And then we also looked at idioms and modern forms in lesson 251. Lesson 252, we looked at changes in you and ye. And then in the bonus lesson, we looked at an additional example in Titus 2:13, Numbers chapter 7, and then some more miscellaneous readings. We did that in the bonus lesson that we had last time. And just again briefly, what my thoughts are on that bonus lesson is what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those examples and then I'm going to sort of intersperse them within the notes of the previous lessons where they would fit. So when this gets published, there won't be a bonus lesson. All the material from the bonus lesson will be moved backwards into the appropriate spot. So that's what my thinking is on that. So in this lesson, we want to conclude our discussion of F.S. Paris and pivot towards a discussion of Benjamin Blaney and the Oxford edition of 1769. In order to accomplish this task, we will be covering the following 2 points. First, I'm going to offer some final thoughts on F.S. Paris, and then second, we're going to begin discussing Benjamin Blaney and the Oxford text. Some of the history of how that came to be and what Oxford was attempting to accomplish, and some of those kinds of things. So let's get into the first point, which is final thoughts on F.S. Paris. All right. So Professor Gordon Campbell concludes his discussion of F.S. Paris by stating the following, quote, "The folio Bible that Paris produced from Cambridge University in 1743 was an important addition because of the principles on which it was edited. The full implementation of those principles, however, was not accomplished until an Oxford editor assumed the task and produced what is in effect the modern text of the King James Version." So that's going to be Blayney. So Blayney is essentially going to pick this up where Paris kind of left some things undone, is generally the way that people understand this to have occurred. Okay, very bottom of page 1. Dr. David Norton also comments on these developments in a textual history of the King James Bible. He concludes his discussion of Paris by referring to the judgment of F.H.A. Scribner. Quote, page 2. "Paris worked mainly on scholarly textual correction, italicization, and marginal notes and cross-references, doing more, as Scribner observed, to bring these into their modern state than the better-known Oxford edition of 1769. So if you want to read Scribner's discussion, you're going to want to see page 29 of Scribner's, the authorized edition of the English Bible, 1611. Okay? So, judging from these statements, it seems fair to conclude that Blayney completed what Paris started in terms of editing the text. So that's generally the way this is understood, that Paris, makes a leap forward. But we also know that was Paris building on the shoulders of a currently unknown editor who edited the text for Cambridge in 1683. By the way, tomorrow I'm recording an interview with myself and Alex where we're going to make an announcement that we think we've determined who that editor is. So it should be an interesting video. Alex has sort of uncovered some stuff, and so he and I are going to have a conversation where we record that, and then if all goes as planned, Thursday of this week, I'll be releasing that Thursday morning, okay? So we definitely have moved the ball forward on that. I'm not going to say more about that, otherwise we'll letting the cat out of the bag on my conversation with Alex. So before officially passing the torch to Benjamin Blaney, the next major editor to impact the text, some conclusory thoughts on F.S. Paris are in order. Referring to Paris's 1743 edition, Wikipedia cites David McKitterick in support of the following statement, quote, "This edition was reprinted," so this would be the 1743 edition of Paris. "This edition was reprinted in 1747 and 1752. Still not satisfied, Paris made substantial further alterations for the prolonged 1756-1758 edition. Paris's revision of the text culminated a little before his death in the 1760 octavo edition. This was reprinted without further changes in a 1762 folio edition printed by Joseph Bentham." So that's sort of the trajectory of Paris, okay? What he does in 1743 is reprinted in 1747 and again in 1752. Still not satisfied, he does some additional work. That's published essentially in 1760 in an octavo edition. He dies that same year, and then after his death, the 1762 editions are published by Cambridge University, and those are viewed as sort of the complete work of F.S. Paris, if you will, okay? So Wikipedia offers McKitterick's 400 years of university printing by Cambridge University Press from 1984 as the source source for the above statement. While I cannot find the contents of the citation in the source cited by Wikipedia, I consider the information to be generally correct regarding the life and career of F.S. Paris, judging by clues gleaned from A.S. Herbert's Historical Catalog of Printed Editions of the English Bible, 1525 to 1961, and you'd want to see pages 265, 267, 272, and 274. So, Wikipedia gives a citation for the information. I go and look at that source that they're citing for that information, and I can't find in that source what Wikipedia is saying came from that source. So what I did is I circled back using the Herbert catalog to check some of those statements as far as the years and the printings, and as far as what I can glean from what the catalog lists, I think that's an accurate statement, although Wikipedia is once again not accurate in the sourcing of those statements, okay? So before we move on then to Benjamin Blaney and the Oxford text, does anybody have any comments or questions about the first point for today's lesson? Okay, if there are no questions, we'll move on to point number 2 then, which is Benjamin Blaney and the Oxford text. Professor Gordon Campbell, author of Bible, the Story of the King James Version, 1611 to 2011, introduced his readership to Benjamin Blaney with the following paragraph. Is it just me, or is there a space in Benjamin that shouldn't be there? If you look at that line, right here, is there... There's not. There is on my copy for some reason. It must be a snafu with the printer, but when I look up here, it looks right. Right? Okay. Yeah. So, again, here's what he says about Blayney. Quote, "Benjamin Blaney is little known today, but he might rightly be regarded as the single most important individual in the history of the King James Version, because the 21st century text of the Bible is essentially Blayney's text. Blayney was a clergyman, a Hebraist, and an academic with a fellowship at Hertford College, Oxford. Blayney was asked by the university press to prepare a corrected edition of the King James Version. The impetus for this project was the work of Paris at Cambridge, and the instructions of the Oxford delegates specified that the Cambridge editions of 1743 and 1760 should be used as part of the scholarly underpinning of the new Oxford edition. So let's stop right there. If that's true, then Blayney is picking up with where Paris left off and moving it forward, okay? Because according to the directions of the Oxford delegates, he was supposed to look at the 1743 text of Blayney and then the 1760 text of Blayney and then go from there. So those would have been his starting points. Those would have been Blayney's starting points as he goes about his work, okay? These two editions were to be collated with the first edition and with Lloyd's folio of 1701, in stipulating that the first edition, described as the original and most authentic edition, should be an integral part of the process. The delegates were introducing an important principle, but there was a difficulty. They did not know which was the first edition. They therefore decided to consult Thomas Secker, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop was uncertain, but thought it was probably the Roman type folio of 1612. Top of the next page. Blayney volunteered to edit the Cambridge edition, for which he was paid £350. That's pretty good. I didn't do the conversion, but that's not nothing to sneeze at that day and time. So, Mike, maybe we make a note there that I should run the conversion on that.
Okay.
And then I'll insert that later. An account of the principles is embodied in a report to the Vice Chancellor and the delegates, which was a sufficient public interest to be published in the Gentleman's Magazine in November 1769. Okay, so all this is going to get published in a journal, in a periodical, and we'll look at that here in a minute. So far what we see here is that Oxford is going to pick up the text. Blayney is going to volunteer to do the job. He's going to get paid to do the job, and he's going to start with the 1743, 1760 Cambridge editions that had been edited by Paris. He's going to look at a 1701 folio, and then he's going to look at, quote, the original or most authentic. And we'll get into what he means by that here in a minute, okay? So, in his textual history, Professor Norton also comments on the circumstances that culminated in Benjamin Blaney editing the text for Oxford University Press. Dr. Norton writes, quote, "The Oxford edition, the third of the outstanding folios, propagated, and especially in matters of spelling and grammar, developed Paris's work. Presumably in response to the developments manifest in the Cambridge folios, Oxford had determined in October 1764 that the lessee of its Bible press should provide one or more copies of the Bible accurately collated with the original or most authentic edition of the present translation, and these and no other shall hereafter be used in correcting the books to be printed by virtue of this lease, making due allowance for modern variations in mere orthography." And you can see Carter's volume there if you want more information on that. Continue with the quote, "Explicit concern for the original or most authentic edition is something we have not seen in the century." So what he means there is no one in the 1700s has talked about this since Kilburn talked about it in the 1600s. That's what he means, okay? So explicit concern for the original or most authentic edition is something we have not seen in the century since Kilburn's campaign. The delegates did not know what text to take, so the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Secker, was asked, quote, what copy of an English Bible His Grace would recommend as a proper standard for the university printer. Secker, too, did not know. He thought the first edition was the 1612 Roman folio and replied that he had heard that Paris, quote, took great pains in some good work. This was not to be the last time one of the university presses found itself ignorant of the basis of the text. The present book comes from a similar inquiry made by Cambridge University Press in 1994. So we'll get to what he's talking about. What he's meaning by original and most authentic edition would be, what is the first edition of the King James Bible printed? That's what they mean. They don't know. The Archbishop of Canterbury thinks it's one from 1612. I scratch my head and I'm like, well, how could you possibly think that when we know, history knows that the text was first printed in 1611. So I'm not sure why the Archbishop of Canterbury would have thought that, okay? But given such meager information, the Oxford delegates ordered a collation of the Cambridge editions of 1743 and 1760 with the first edition of Lloyd's 1701 folio, and they sought an editor. Benjamin Blaney, later to be Regius Professor of Hebrew, volunteered. His report to the Vice-Chancellor and delegates, reproduced in Appendix 7, gives a good sense of what he did and the problems and labor involved. Okay? So, before we go any further, does anybody have any comments or questions about what's going on here with Oxford University Press and their conception of building on the work of Paris to make another edition?
Was there a call for all this work to be done? I mean, was there
That's an interesting question. The way I guess I would endeavor to try to answer that.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, I don't.
I think what they realized, possibly, so I admit I'm speculating a little bit, but I think it's an educated speculation. I think they realized that while Paris did a pretty good job, he missed some stuff. That some of his editorial principles had gone, where he didn't catch everything maybe that they thought he should have caught, and so therefore they thought, well, we can make another pass on this, adopt the same principles as Paris, and hopefully, fix the text. Fix it in the sense of stabilize it, not fix it in the sense that there's, tons of foolish errors or that sort of thing in it. Okay? Anybody else?
So are they just updating the language basically to put it in the more current English of the day?
I think that, what have we already seen them do? We've seen them, if you go back to page 1, what kind of changes did Paris make? He made changes to the nouns, he changes to the definite articles, he made changes to the possessives. Blayney, as over the next couple weeks in lessons, we're going to be looking at what did Blayney do, and you're going to see that he basically just took Paris's editorial principles and extended them consistently throughout the text. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anyone have a question over here? Okay. So in Appendix 7 of A Textual History, Professor Norton reproduces in its entirety the piece that Blayney published in the November 1769 issue of the Gentleman's Magazine. The following is a reproduction of Blayney's article as it appears in Appendix 7 of Norton's book on pages 195 to 197. Please see Appendix A for screenshots of the original article. If you guys go all the way to the back of your notes, I attached an appendix to this where I provided you the screenshots from the actual article. So here is the title page of the Gentleman's Magazine. And by the way, this wasn't like a perverted magazine. I feel like I need to say that because in our day and age, somebody says that and they might think the wrong thing, okay? But the Gentleman's Magazine, and from down here you can see the date, November 1769. So that's a screenshot of the title page. And then on the top of page 10, this is the introduction to the article where you have the account of the collation of the revision of the Bible. So this is a screenshot of the actual article from 1769 as it appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine, announcing to the public sort of what Oxford was doing, what Blayney was doing, and why all of this was being done. Okay? So I just give that to you. For our purposes, though, we're going to go back to the bottom of page 3, and we're going to read it out of the notes just because it's easier to read. But I did want to point out that the whole thing was shared with you. Now, we are going to read this, and I'll stop and make comments as we go through it, because it's important, I think, for you guys to get a hold of what Blayney said in his own words. Okay? So bottom of page 3, again, this is Appendix 7 from Norton's book, Blayney's account of the collation and revision of the Bible, Gentleman's Magazine, Volume 39, November 1769. and the page numbers run in the original edition from 517 to 519, okay? Top page 4. This is what the article says. The editor of the 2 editions of the Bible lately printed at the Clarendon Press, that's a reference to Oxford, okay, thinks it his duty, now that he has completed the whole in a course of between 3 and 4 years close application, to make his report to the delegates of the manner in the which the work has been executed and hopes for their approbation. So how long did he spend on this? How long does he say he spent on this?
3 to 4 years.
It says 3 to 4 years, okay? And now he's given a report. So the project is done, the Bible's been printed, and now he's given a report of what he did and how he did it, okay? Now, look at the next paragraph. In the first place, according to the instructions he received, the folio edition of 1611, that of 1701, published under the direction of Bishop Lloyd, and 2 Cambridge editions of a late date, one in quarto, the other in octavo, have been carefully collated, whereby many errors that were found in former editions have been corrected, and the text reformed to such a standard of purity as it is presumed. It is, what's that? Oh. As it is presumed, it is not to be met with any other edition hitherto extant. So in other words, is he saying that he thinks after this 3 to 4 year project and making these comparisons that he has the most accurate text?
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. Okay? Next paragraph. The punctuation has been carefully attended to, not only with a view to preserve the true sense, but also to uniformity as far as was possible. So he's trying to preserve the sense, and at the same time he's trying to make it uniform. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. Over the last number of months worth of studies, have we not seen tons of punctuation changes from edition to edition?
Yes.
Yes. So he's trying to make it uniform. That's what he says in this report. Okay? Next paragraph. Frequent recourse has been made to the Hebrew and Greek originals, as on other occasions. So with a special regard to the words not expressed in the original language, but which our translators have thought it fit to insert in italics in order to make out the sense after the English idiom, or to preserve the connection. So in other words, is he saying he also looked at the italics? So he went back, he looked at the English italics, and he went back to the Hebrew and Greek, and he's also trying to make sure that the italics is what? Accurate and correct, okay? And though Dr. Paris made large corrections in this particular, in an edition published at Cambridge, there still remained many necessary alterations which escaped the doctor's notice. So is he admitting that Paris also made changes to italics? But he's also saying that he found more changes to the italics that escaped whose notice? That escaped Paris's notice, okay? In making which the edition chose not to rely on his own judgment singly, but submitted them all to the previous examination of the Select Committee, and particularly of the principal of Hertford College and Mr. Professor Wheeler. A list of the above alterations was intended to have been given in to the Vice Chancellor at this time, but the editor was not yet found time to make it completely out. So I take it he didn't have enough time to list every single what? Every single change he made. That's the way I take that. Okay? Considerable alterations have been made in the heads, so that would be the chapter headings, okay, or contents prefixed to the chapters. So that would be, I think I can do this quick. I have a page from the 1611 called up here, okay? What page is this? So this is 2 Corinthians 5. So what he's talking about there is this stuff. The headings at the top of the pages, this stuff here at the top of the pages, and then these kind of like chapter summaries that are there for every chapter. So if you look back at your notes, considerable alterations have been made in the heads or contents prefixed to the chapters. That's what he's talking about, what I just showed you visually, okay? As will appear on inspection. And though the editor is unwilling to enlarge upon the labor bestowed by himself in this particular, he cannot avoid taking notice of the particular obligations, which both himself and the public lie under the principle of Hertford College, Mr. Griffith of Pembroke College, Mr. Wheeler, poetry professor, and the late warden of New College, so long as he lived to bear a part in it, who with a prodigious expense of time and inexpressible fatigue, so in other words, he kept at this work, to themselves judiciously corrected and improved the rude and imperfect draughts of the editor. I love the way these guys talk. So he's talking about that. What he's essentially saying is that they spent a lot of time going through this type of material and in their mind fixing it. Okay. The running titles at the top of the columns in each page, how trifling a circumstance soever it may appear, required no small degree of thought and attention. So again, he's talking about this type of stuff at the top of the page. So they spend a lot of time on what I would consider that to be ancillary stuff. Okay? Many of the proper names being left untranslated, whose etymology was necessary to be known in order to a more perfect comprehension of the allusions in the text, the translation of them under the inspection of the above-named committee has been for the benefit of the unlearned supplied where. So, in other words, if the text says Isaias, they would have a note, they would add a note to the margin that said that means Isaiah. That's what he just said. That's what he means. Does that make sense? Okay. Some obvious material errors in the chronology have been considered and rectified. The marginal references, even in Bishop Lloyd's Bible, had in many places suffered by the inaccuracy of the press. Subsequent editions had copied those errors, and added many others of their own. So it became absolutely necessary to turn to and compare the several passages, which have been done in every single instance, and by this precaution, several false references brought to light, which would otherwise have passed unsuspected. So in other words, did they check literally every cross-reference? So if the text, so let's see if we can grab a quick example of a cross-reference from this page. Doesn't look like there's any on that page. But if there was a cross-reference in the page, they would check all the cross-references, and they discovered that there were some errors in the cross-references. All right, moving on. It has been the care of the editor to rectify these as far as he could by critical conjecture where the copies universally failed him, as they did in most of the errors discovered in Bishop Lloyd's edition. In some few instances, he confesses himself to have been at a loss in finding out the true reference. So he's saying some of these he couldn't figure out what they were supposed to be referencing. Okay, though the corruption was manifest in the want of any of the most distant resemblance, right? Yeah. Resemblance, between the passages compared together. Cases of this sort indeed did not often occur, so that a very small number only of the old references are, with the sanction of the committee, omitted and their places more usefully supplied. So in other words, are there a lot of places that they found that this would apply to, or relatively few? He says, so that a very small number only of the old references are, with the sanction of the committee, what? Omitted. So the vast majority of the original references does he leave in? Yeah. That's what he means. Okay, next paragraph. It had been suggested by the late Archbishop of Canterbury that an improvement might be made in the present editions of the Bible by taking in a number of additional references, of which many useful ones, as he supported, might be furnished from other editions referred to by him, and particularly from a Scotch edition. So is he now saying that they've added additional cross-references? So they went through the ones that were originally there and tried to make sure those were correct. And then at the behest of the Archbishop of Canterbury, do they add new cross-references? Okay? Of which the present Vice-Chancellor was kind enough to lend a copy. The references found in it, which were indeed very numerous, having been severally turned to and examined, such of them were selected as the editor judged most pertinent, together with the others that occurred from his own reading and observation. In doing this, he has endeavored to keep clear much of the fanciful allusions of which too many presented themselves in the before named Scotch edition. So in other words, Blayney doesn't approve of all the other cross-references that have been added over the years, particularly in this Scotch edition, and so he leaves those what? Out. Does everybody understand what he's saying? And to adhere as near as possible to the plan marked out in the former collection made by Bishop Lloyd, pointing out such passages chiefly where the same history or the same name was introduced, the same matter treated of, or sentiment expressed, or at least where parallels might fairly be drawn, and sometimes where a similar use of a particular word or expression tended to illustrate the application of it on another occasion. So in other words, he's saying what kind of references they allowed in. Is everybody following that? Okay. The number of references being thus augmented considerably, the collation upon the whole will, it is hoped, be regarded as useful in the light of a concordance, material as well as verbal, always at hand. So in other words, does he view himself as trying to improve the ancillary notes, the marginal notes as a use of cross-references to aid the reader almost in a form of a concordance?
Right.
So I have a Schofield Reference Bible and I have center column cross-references down the center. Okay? Are those inspired?
No.
Those are Schofield's what?
Concordance notes.
Those are things that he thinks are what? Useful or cross-references. I look at them and sometimes I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess I can see. And other times I look at them and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I was always told that it was a good idea to compare words that you had questions with other texts of the same, so that concordance idea was the idea to bring it together and get a general...
Yeah, and that's perfectly legitimate.
Yeah.
So that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Next paragraph. In this state, the quarto copy was sent to press, and the first proofs carefully collated with the copy, both text and margin, after which the second proofs were again read, and generally speaking, the third likewise. So in other words, the way I understand that is, did they go through like 3 different checkpoints in this process before they actually put this thing out to the public? So check out what he says. Okay. In this state, the quarto copy was sent to the press, and the first proofs carefully collated with the copy. So they compare the first proofs with the copy that they sent, right? Both text and margin. Then he says, after which the second proofs were again read, and generally speaking, the third likewise. So I take that to mean that they tried to subject this to 3 different checks for accuracy before they make it public. That's the way I understand what he's saying. Does anybody understand it different? Okay? Not to mention the frequent revisions of proofs besides, which are common in correcting the press. So he's talking about what they did to make sure they were accurate, right? This proved indeed a very tiresome and tedious task, I can only imagine, but was not more than was absolutely necessary in order to attain to the degree of accuracy that was wished. A particular attention was required with respect to the figures belonging to the marginal references, where errors were continually creeping in after a manner that would appear highly astonishing to those who have never been concerned in correcting multitudes of figures as they came from the press. Okay? Top page 6. When the quarto sheets were printed off, the forms were lengthened out in order to make up the folio edition. So now he's explaining how they move it from a quarto to what? A folio. Okay? So it sounds to me that what they do is they make the quarto, they double, triple check it. Then once they're satisfied with it, then they take that and then they use that to create the folio. That's why I understand what he's saying, right? So when quarto sheets were printed off, the forms were lengthened out in order to make up the folio edition. In doing which the parts were often so jumbled together and such confusion introduced by misplacing the references and mistaking the chronology that nothing else would suffice than a fresh collation of the whole with the quarto copy. So then once they have that folio done, then they compare it to the quarto that's done, and they find there's a bunch of errors not where? In the folio. That's the way I understand this, right? That nothing else would suffice than a fresh collation of the whole with the quarto copy, and a repetition of almost the same trouble and care in the revisal and in making up the running titles anew as had been used before. But the editor thinks he has just reason to congratulate himself. That's, oh boy, okay. He's really done a good job, hasn't he? Okay. Congratulate himself on the opportunity hereby given him in discovering and correcting some of the few trivial inaccuracies which in spite of all his vigilance had escaped his notice in the quarto edition. So then he finds, so now at this stage, as he finds stuff that he didn't find in the quarto, so now he's got to go back and fix that. I'm telling you right now, guys, by this point, I would be pulling my hair out. Okay? So that the folio edition is rendered by this somewhat the more perfect of the two, and therefore more fit to be recommended for a standard copy. So in Blayney's estimation, which one is he saying is the more accurate of the two, the quarto or the folio?
Folio.
He's saying the folio is the more accurate copy, and he's saying this one should be the standard by which the text is judged. Okay? The editor humbly hopes this account of his proceedings will not be unacceptable to the board, and will think his time and pains not ill bestowed. If he shall have succeeded in his desire of giving satisfaction to those who honored him with the employment and of contributing in any wise to God's honor and the public utility. Benjamin Blaney, Hertford College, October 25, 1769. Okay? So what we just read is Blayney's own description of what he did. Now, we haven't been able to do this with any of the other people because, to my knowledge, they never really wrote such a document. Okay? So before we move on, does anybody have any comments, questions, thoughts, or impressions of Blayney's article piece there?
This isn't like, I don't remember what lesson it was before, but when those guys were talking up there, it was like they were advertised it when they were talking.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So that's not, this is, so that you can
yeah,
sell,
well, I think
sell more, saying that, hey, now we've got
so I think, as we'll see in a minute, I think Norton is going to think that he's kind of congratulating himself a little too much and that maybe he wasn't as great as he says he was. I'll be honest with you. I think this one is more of a honest representation of what he did and what he tried to do. What we saw previous with that article, I know what you're talking about, that article.
That Bible turned out.
That Bible was that was one of the worst Bibles that Kilburn ever looked at. So I think the situation here is much better than what we saw previously in the circa 1660 area there. Okay. So regarding Blayney's Gentleman's Magazine report, Gordon Campbell wrote the following quote: "The report courteously acknowledges the corrections made by Paris and presents the new edition as a continuation of his endeavors. Blayney explains that he has lavished time on the chapter summaries, on the italics, on the running headings at the top of the column of each page, and on the correction of chronology of Bishop Usher. He also translated proper names in the margin for the benefit of the unlearned. This was a period at which Greek and Hebrew were taught in England's English schools as well as universities. Anyone without the basic linguistic competence were deemed the unlearned. The edition of Bishop Lloyd is taken to task for fanciful or inaccurate cross-references, which Blayney was able to correct with recourse to a Scottish edition, of which the present Vice-Chancellor was kind enough to lend a copy. The result of his labors, in Blayney's immodest estimation, was a text, quote, reformed to such a standard of purity as it is presumed is not to be met in any other edition hitherto extant. So he thinks he's a little bit immodest as well. Okay? The observations at once deferential and triumphalist. So in other words, he's somewhat self-deprecating and he's also somewhat self-what? Praising, right? That's what Gordon Campbell means. Are almost entirely concerned with the apparatus surrounding the text of the Bible, which makes the report more interesting for its silences than for its assertions. It does not mention what the delegates had described in an Olympian phrase as modern variation in mere orthography, and it is silent on the subject matter, including word order and punctuation. So, what is Campbell saying? He didn't say anything. In everything we just read from what Blayney said, did he say anything about what he did to the actual biblical text? No. He was talking about all of the ancillary stuff, the chapter headings, the column headings, the cross-references, and all that. He didn't say anything about what he did to the actual scriptural text. Okay? You can go back and read it and you'll see that that's the case. Ironically, it is the change in these unspoken areas that make Blayney's folio edition of 1769 the most important text since 1611. The edition that was to become the authoritative text for subsequent editions. So what Campbell's pointing out is he talked about all this stuff, but he didn't talk about the most important thing. And that's, what did he do to the actual biblical text? Is everybody following that? Okay? Professor Norton states the following regarding Blayney's published report. Quote, mere orthography gets no attention, punctuation, a passing comment, and all that he says of the readings is that the text was collated as instructed and reformed to such a standard of purity as it is presumed not to be met in any other edition hitherto extant, a claim too vague to be helpful. So in other words, he's saying a lot without really saying much, is kind of what Norton's getting at, right? Let's see. The one quasi-textual item that is commented on in some detail is the revision of the italics. For the rest, he is concerned with extra textual matters, the chapter summaries and running titles, the notes, cross-references, and chronology. Finally, he relates the care with which the work was seen through the press, in spite of these claims to have given the most attention to editorial aids to the understanding of the text. The italics are one such aid rather than the genuine matter of the text. His most significant contribution was to the spelling and, in some respects, grammar of the text. It will be no surprise to find Blayney's claims exceeded his achievement. Neither the work on the text nor the vaunted attention to the correctness of the printing was perfect. Scrivener, with none of the clarity that an editor ought to accord to a predecessor, none of the charity that an editor ought to accord to his predecessor, if nothing more than the fear of being found similarly fallible, judges the latter conspicuously deficient, and adds that, quote, the commonly estimated number of 116 such errata or errors would seem below the truth. A quarto, H. 1196, was prepared at the same time as the folio, but in spite of the blemishes, Blayney considered the folio, quote, somewhat the more perfect of the two, and therefore more fit to be recommended for a standard copy. Carter reports that it was for many years the standard by which Oxford Bibles were corrected. That is to say, Blayney's folio was corrected in manuscript by many hands, of course, in course of time. The folio volume kept for reference was hardly a page. Am I reading that right? The folio volume kept for reference was hardly a page except in the Apocrypha, without a corrector's mark carefully written in ink. All but a few of these amendments are of slight significance: a capital instead of a small letter in a reference, a comma added, and English spelling modernized. As well as Oxford, most other printers at home and abroad took Blayney as the standard, so that the text as now generally found is not that of the first edition, but something that evolved unevenly over a century and a half before becoming nearly fixed by the standards of the 1760s imperfectly applied. So in other words, when a preacher stands in a pulpit today and preaches from a 1769 text, are they preaching from exactly the same words that the King James translators put there in 1611? No. Okay? So Campbell and Norton both point to an annotated copy of Blayney's 1769 edition in the possession of Cambridge University as a tool in understanding the scale of the changes made by the Oxford editor. So top page 9, or top page 8. So the quote from Campbell: "The sheer scale of the changes wrought by Blayney on the text can be seen in a copy of his editions owned and annotated by a clergyman called Gilbert Buchanan, who collated Blayney's folio with what he thought was the first edition of the King James Version, but was in fact the second edition known as the She Bible. Thousands of changes in italics, spelling, punctuation, chapter headings, and cross-references are noted, and the cumulative effect is quite overwhelming." So what this Buchanan guy did is he took Blayney and he collated it with a 1611 She Bible, the second one printed, and he noted in his Bible every what? Change. Okay? Then regarding this, Norton says, quote, "One of the more extraordinary copies of the Bible I have seen is in the Cambridge University's library copy of Blayney's folio. It was purchased by Gilbert Buchanan in 1882 for 9 guineas, 1822, excuse me, for 9 guineas, and minutely annotated throughout for its variations, from which he takes to be the first edition. Though it is clear from some of the variations that he was using the second edition." So what he means there is the 1611 She Bible, not the 1611 He Bible, which was the first one. We already talked about all that in the past. Okay. At the beginning, he notes that, quote, "The variations are chiefly in the pointing and italic words or to the text, but the contents of the chapters are very much altered. And besides the obsolete spelling, many of the proper names are differently spelled. The annotations constitute an overwhelming mine of information. Most verses elicit several annotations, so that as a whole Buchanan's labors give a strong visual impression of the multitudinous, right?
Yeah.
Multitudinous variations in minutia by which Blayney's Bible and following it, modern King James Bibles, differs from the original." Now, I have looked for, these guys have pictures of this in the book, their books, but the pictures are just not good enough for me to reproduce them in the notes. I wanted to give you a picture of a page, but when I tried to do it, it just didn't come through very clear. So I sort of abandoned it. So before dealing with examples of changes made by Blayney, Dr. Norton offers the following summative statement. Quote, "I note 99 surviving textual variants from Paris and 58 from Blayney. Okay? In addition to the usual possibilities of error in such figures, there now arises the difficult question of distinguishing textual variants from orthographic variation." So orthographic variation would be variation in what? Spelling. Okay? "The most significant thing is that the majority of the variants are matters of the English of the translation. 3/4, 74 of Paris's variants, and nearly 3/5, 39 of Blayney's are of this sort." Okay? So in the next lesson, we're going to actually start looking at some of the changes that Blayney made. So, anybody have any comments or questions about Blayney, the Oxford edition, the circumstances or the report that Blayney gave. And then again, if you want to check out the actual article from, the text is the same, but it's a little bit kind of cool to look at it in its original form if you're interested in doing that. So I included it in the appendix at the end. So, the Oxford text is edited by Blayney. He picks up with what Paris did. He conceivably brings it through to its conclusion. Okay? Most of the changes he makes are to the chapter headings, the column headings, the cross-references, the marginal notes, the dating issues. Those are the things that he talks about in the article for the Gentleman's Magazine from November 1769. But the real important stuff he didn't really touch on, and that is what kind of changes did he actually make to the biblical text. So that's where we're going to pick this up next week and start looking at some of the changes that Blayney made to the text. And again, the main takeaway from all of this is the following. Is the text that people read from today the same as the 1611? It is not verbatim, identical, the same. Is it substantively the same? Yes. But it is not a photocopy. It is not verbatim identical. There are changes that have been made. Word changes, punctuation changes, spelling changes. And all of them are not the correction of printer errors, despite what some people want to say. Okay? So next week, we're going to start looking at what did Blayney do to the text? How did he carry on with the principles that had been set up by F.S. Paris? So, anybody have any comments or questions? Bart?
And Dr. Norton in his last paragraph there notes there was 99 surviving textual variants of Paris and 58 from Blayney, so that they were comparing 99 variations of the text?
No. What that means is Paris's work introduced 99 changes compared to prior
individual changes.
99 individual changes that survive into the present.
Okay, I thought they were variations.
Yeah, that's what he
that they were
means.
changing
No.
every couple of years.
That's what he means.
Okay.
So what he means is Paris made these 99 changes that have survived into the text as it stands now.
Okay, that makes more sense.
To those 99, where's the number here? Blayney adds an additional 58.
Okay.
That's what he's saying. Does that make more
Are
sense?
those 58 additional or 58 that he changes from Paris's?
No, those are 58 additional to the ones from Paris. Okay? All right, anybody else got a comment or question? Was there any scuttlebutt in the comments? No? No scuttlebutt. Okay, that's good. No scuttlebutt's good. All right, well, if nobody has any comments or questions, we'll be done 5 minutes early and continue looking at things next Sunday. Appreciate everyone being here and for your